I'm really happy for our conversation today. We have roughly 330 folks that are interested in hearing what BCI is offering to provide to the community. So I just want to preface today for our meeting that this is going to be a level set. Recently, the Army Corps of Engineers has provided the alternatives within the Buffalo Bayou study concerning Addicks and Barker. So today we are trying to showcase what those alternatives mean for Houston, how we got here, the issues with Addicks and Barker, and some of our concerns with the alternatives that have come out recently. I want to thank our panelists. They'll be jumping on here in the next 30 minutes for being on here today. They are experts in this field, and they're also some great folks that go back and forth when it comes to policy. I want to, again, thank everyone here. All the attendees, your cameras are off, your audio is off. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, feel free to use the Q&A, and feel free to raise your hand. We'll do our best to get to those questions. After Jim is completed with his presentation, we'll turn it over to Mustafa Tamiz, who will be the panelist, or sorry, will host and moderate our panelists today. And again, we're trying to have an honest conversation about what these alternatives mean for Houston and what can be done at the community level to ensure that Houston is continuing to stay protected. So with that, Jim, if you'd like to share your screen and begin, we're happy to have you.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Hopefully, we'll have an informative and perhaps lively discussion about the topic we kind of titled this overall presentation is, has the Army Corps of Engineers giving up on Houston? And I think they probably have not, but it's a tricky issue dealing with the solutions to the flooding on Buffalo Bayou, and particularly with Addicks and Barker. And my subpart's called Understanding the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I'll just start by saying I'm not sure anybody truly understands the Corps, themselves included, but I have the highest respect for the Corps. I also have taught environmental law for the Corps back from about 78 to about 92, 93. I've also sued the Corps of Engineers on a number of occasions and have worked with them on a number of occasions. So I humbly will try to help understand kind of what we're dealing with here. Buffalo Bayou has been a problem for Houston since the inception. It's a relatively small bayou with a lot of tributaries and with a large drainage area. And huge floods in 1929 and 1935 caused Houston to ask for help from the federal government. The Corps of Engineers ended up being designated to come in and help. That's where Harris County Flood Control District came from. Was formed to be the local sponsor to work with the Corps on Addicks and Barker reservoirs. Addicks and Barker are the two dark blue reservoirs. This is Addicks on the north and Barker to the south. The Addicks watershed actually gets overflow from Cypress Creek. So you will see, as we'll talk about it, there are complications that come because of that. Barker's a more isolated watershed back here to the west. But the primary point here is Addicks and Barker are sort of the gateways into downtown Houston, and basically have been the best flood control investment that we've ever had in this part of the world. They have been incredibly successful, but they also have had problems from the beginning. Now, in terms of understanding the Corps, a couple of things to keep in mind. They're a federal agency. They're subject to federal environmental law. They also have a very specific rule structure. They have principles and standards, which essentially guides their internal deliberation process. They're subject to the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires environmental review and environmental impact statements. So there's some really some rules and regulations they have that a lot of our local and state agencies do not. Historically, the Corps has had a very strong relationship with Congress. Many of the projects that we have in around the country came from earmarks, which were basically special relationship projects, usually done by some congressman or woman or some senator. And essentially, they, you might say, were kind of special interest projects that got able to be approved by Congress, perhaps without a rigorous review. Much of that was changed in the 1970s and 1980s, and a more rigorous process of trying to determine what projects made it to Congress, and then more recently earmarks were removed. So it's a much more kind of hands-tied process today than it used to be. The Corps of Engineers is within the executive branch of the government. They're part of the Department of Defense. They're part of the Department of Army. They are subject to oversight. We have a colonel that runs the Galveston district that is subject to generals in the division in Dallas, subject to the Secretary of the Army. So there is a chain of command associated with the Corps. The Corps does not interact a lot with citizens other than perhaps with formal requirements under environmental laws or various types of public outreach requirements. Citizens generally don't interact with the Corps on a daily basis. The Corps does its business down in the office in Galveston, and we often don't see much of the Corps. I think that's too bad, but it's just kind of the way the structure is. The internal process of the Corps is not particularly open as well. And we never see the interplay between local government, between the local district and the higher levels, which I think is a particularly important issue in the Buffalo Bayou work that's been done. The original plan on Buffalo Bayou was to build Addicks and Barker, which were built, to channelize Buffalo Bayou, which was never done, to have a diversion channel, the South Channel that went around to Galveston Bay near Seabrook, and a north diversion channel coming out of a White Oak Bayou reservoir, going to the San Jacinto River, and then coming over here on Cypress Creek, there was actually a levee to prevent the overflow coming in. Very little of that was actually constructed. Only really the reservoirs, Addicks and Barker, were the major two projects that were completed. The rest of the project was never completed. And Addicks and Barker ran into problems almost as soon as they got started. Condemnation was required to obtain the land for the pools of Addicks and Barker. Those condemnation hearings were very, very hotly contested. The local politics got very hot, and ultimately the decision was made to stop the condemnation process before the entire area that would be flooded by Addicks and Barker was obtained. So the government never took possession of all of the lands that could be flooded by essentially the levee design of Addicks and Barker. And that has created a huge problem that frankly exists until today. Now, that problem is amplified on this map. This map shows in light red the area the government owns. In dark red, the area that actually was private property that got developed that flooded in Harvey. And about 10,000 houses are in there. And then the dark blue area is the kind of the full flood pool of Addicks and Barker. And the squares you see, these little rectangles that are all kind of marked in green here, those are utility districts. And those I'm using as an indicator for development because that's the process we use to develop areas outside of the city of Houston. And as you can see, a number of utility districts are into the red area as well as into the dark blue area, indicating the development that exists really in the flood pool of Addicks and Barker today. That is a huge problem. We've got about 20,000 homes in that area. Another problem in about 2008, 2009, 2010 time period, Addicks and Barker were classified DSAC 1, which is essentially a hazard classification associated with the potential of dam failure. An interim reservoir control plan was put out in 2010, and it said the purpose of this reservoir plan was to reduce the risk of catastrophic failure by evacuating pools quicker and increasing embankment surveillance. Well, what that means is that there is a risk that Addicks over here and Barker down here could fail. And if they failed, there would be flooding that would come all the way down into the Houston area. That has complicated the operation of Addicks and Barker and certainly is a safety issue. I'll talk more about that as we get later on. Another part of the problem is communication. This is a map showing the pathway of Hurricane Harvey. Back in August 24th, it became a hurricane again, and it made landfall on the 25th. We, or at least the Corps of Engineers, had internal projections as far back as the 24th that there would be flooding behind Addicks, behind Barker was what they first noticed. On Thursday, they came up with a projection that there would be perhaps 4 to 5 feet of flooding. The lines to watch on these charts I'm going to show you, this blue line is the extent of the government ownership, and that's an elevation. And this is how high the water's going to get. And so as far back as Thursday, the projection was about 99 feet. Once we got to Friday, the concern became also about Addicks as well as Barker, although Addicks was just, a foot or so over the flood pool. Barker's still about 5 feet above the land ownership. And then on Saturday, the projection is much higher for both Addicks and Barker. And again, this is internal with the Corps of Engineers. This was not information I ever saw. And at 11 o'clock on that Saturday, they identified that the first homes would be flooded, or the time when the first homes would be flooded, both behind Addicks and Barker. On Sunday morning at 8 o'clock, even more information, more detailed, and they identified that the first home would be flooded. Again, the timing of that, as well as when the mandatory releases would begin. Now, the point of showing you all of this is that this information was known internally to the Corps. Most of us never heard this information, never knew about it. And most people that I have talked to first found out that there was a potential of flooding when they woke up and stepped into water. We need to make sure that never happens again. We need to be warned and alerted, and I'll talk more about that later. But it's a part of the problem, and I think it has to do with the fact that the Corps isn't used to directly communicating with the public. Another complication on this whole Buffalo Bayou project, there is a lawsuit that is out there. And that lawsuit is by the flood victims, which they have every right to file. And in 2019, December 17th, they won a case before the Federal Court of Claims. This Court of Claims found over here on the right-hand side that the government, through its construction, maintenance, and operation of the Addicks and Barker dams in the past, present, and future, has taken a permanent flowage easement on plaintiff's properties. So this is a federal court finding that the Corps of Engineers basically condemned a flowage easement across roughly 10,000 homes that got flooded in Harvey. Now, that is a huge piece of information and is a critical piece of information about going forward with the future of Addicks and Barker. Then in October of 2020, the Corps released Buffalo Bayou and Tributaries Resilience Study. And this report is really why we're meeting today. This report is, or was, a disappointment to many of us. I would say most all the recipients that I've talked to were surprised with the content of the report. This draft was supposed to have come out, or this report was supposed to come out as a draft in June of 2020. And it came out not as a draft feasibility report, but as an interim report in October. Usually there are massive appendices that are associated with a report like that to represent the extensive work that had been done. There are really no appendices with this report. This has struck me as odd. I've never run across an interim feasibility report. I'd put a red flag on this and just simply say that there's a question of why an interim feasibility report as opposed to the draft feasibility report that was supposed to be issued. This to me just kind of signals something kind of weird going on internally within the Corps. Now, the remainder of this presentation is going to be divided up into several observations, several solutions that have been put forward in that report that I think should be rejected, several solutions I just think are absolutely imperative, and several proposed solutions that I think we should discuss further. I'm really, though, disappointed in the way the Corps of Engineers presented their report, because so much of what I think is the clear information flow was not present in that document. If anything, I think that document confused the situation much more than it clarified anything. And that's a failure on the part of the Corps, in my opinion. First observation, we've got to have full and honest disclosure. We need the truth about the consequences of dam failure. Dam failure really isn't discussed all that much at all in the report. And to me, that's one of the single most important points. That basically, the potential for dam failure implicates how the dams are operated. And it certainly raises all sorts of issues about the safety of those downstream. We need to take dam failure out of the equation, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But first of all, we need to know the truth about it. There's computer modeling that's been done about the consequences of dam failure. The Corps ran computer models during Harvey about the consequences of dam failure. The public in Houston has never seen those. If we were given that information, if we were shown that information, we would demand that those dams be fixed and fixed fast. Secondly, we need the truth about the impact of the taking litigation. If a flood easement is in fact obtained, which those landowners have every right to recover money for what's happened, many may choose to sell. With a flood easement, you likely will not be able to get flood insurance. With the flood easement, the price will go down. It is a likely scenario over time is that lower income residents, either renters or homeowners, will move into this area with a flood easement in place. And I think there is potential for one of the biggest environmental justice disasters in the United States if that is allowed to take place. We simply cannot allow that to take place. We need to know the truth about the review of this report. When and why was the report changed from a draft report with full appendices to an interim report? Who made those decisions? How were they made? And we absolutely need an adequate procedure in place to warn the public about future flooding projections and releases. That information could have been really important to a lot of people that didn't get it. Observation 2. To some extent, there's a bit of code perhaps in this report. The Corps has labeled the homes in the flood pool as having an unacceptable risk. Downstream areas are identified simply as being at risk. I think this term unacceptable risk basically tells us that what the Corps thinks, that we can't allow the 10,000 flooded homes and another 10,000 in the flood pool to not be addressed. We've either got to protect them or buy them out, regardless of benefit cost relationships. Buyout could lead to default on municipal utility bonds. It could lead to a failure to buy out and not protect, could cause an environmental justice issue. Third observation, reform of the benefit cost methodology. There's a disconnect between the 50-year planning horizon and climate change. Our storms are coming more frequently, but this more frequent huge storm occurrence is not reflected in the statistics. And if you do a 50-year plan based on essentially historic statistics, we will not foresee the problems of the future. So we've got to basically reconnect planning methods with climate change. Second, we've got to understand the implications of unacceptable risk, what that means. We really should not be talking in code. And third, we have to understand the environmental justice implications. Now, rejections. I want to suggest that we should reject channelization of Buffalo Bayou. Buffalo Bayou was fought over and has been preserved for a long time. We can solve the flooding problem without channelizing Buffalo Bayou. So I would propose that we reject channelization of Buffalo Bayou. Among other things, the endangered alligator snapping turtle frequents Buffalo, or is at least present in Buffalo Bayou. Yeah, I hate to see that turn into litigation. We just simply don't need to go here. Secondly, a second Houston core value, Katy Prairie. Katy Prairie Conservancy has put together a wonderful land holding out on the west side. It's a wonderful sponge. The third reservoir, if constructed as proposed, would destroy it. I think we have to just simply say it's a Houston core value. We're just not going to do that. We can solve this problem in other ways. Rejected solutions. We cannot allow the environmental justice tragedy to unfold, or basically for people to be allowed to live with a flood easement on their houses. I mean, it does pay them money, but it's really just not the way we ought to be living. We cannot allow the bonds to fail. And if there's a buyout, those essentially utility districts that depend on tax revenues don't have anybody to tax. Those bonds would fail. We cannot allow it. We've got to maintain our financial obligations, our financial representation. And the status quo just is not acceptable. First solution, and this is a solution we have to have. We've got to fix the dams. We've got to release the modeling of impact failure, or the modeling of the failure of the dams and what the impact is. And we've got to have an honest public discussion about it, but we've got to fix those dams. Secondly, we got to have a warning system and an agreed warning protocol. It needs to be worked out ahead of time. We don't want to have a whole lot of discussions about, oh, well, should we release this? When should we release it? Let's get it figured out and can agree that the public deserves to be given information that the Corps is essentially relying on internally. Third, there's a possible solution. After the award of a permanent flood easement, that will be somewhere probably upwards of 80–90% of the value of a home. That is coming out of a different pot of money than the Corps of Engineers project money. For that reason, you could probably go ahead and get and buy out the homes for simply another 10%, maybe 20% of the value. It's a much, much cheaper buyout if the flood easement is in existence. The important point here is that may leave enough additional space that we could also pay off the bonds that have been issued to support that development. I'm not sure if that's possible or not. It needs to be analyzed, but you're not going to analyze it if you don't talk about it in the report, if you don't lay it out, and that has not been laid out in any type of detail, and it should be. Possible solution number 4. We need 200,000 acre feet. An acre foot is enough water to flood 1 acre 1 foot deep. That's 200,000 acres 1 foot deep. The Corps owns, the federal government owns 10,000 acres now. There could even be more land if there's a buyout. If we went 10 feet deep, there'd be 100,000 acre feet of storage. If we went 20 feet deep inside of Addicks and Barker, it'd be 200,000 acre feet of storage. Now, I'm not sure that amount of storage is available, but we were not given sufficient information in the Corps of Engineers reports to be able to evaluate what the underlying geological conditions were. And it did not look like the Corps made an effort to really dig out Addicks and Barker. We ought to get every bit of use out of Addicks and Barker that we can. So that's one possible solution. Second possible solution, Mary Ann and Larry can talk more about this, but there is a proposal for retention areas that could be in the upper Addicks watershed, as well as in Bear and South Mady Creeks, which are also in the Addicks watershed. And there may be upwards of 100,000 acre feet that could be pulled together with various alternatives here. I think the point being that with creativity, we can put together work inside of the reservoirs. We can put together work in the watershed. We might have to have some buyouts to go with that, but there is an alternative that will solve this problem. And then possible solution number 6, tunnel system. There's a lot of work that has been done and a lot of innovation that has come in tunneling. And I think that the prospect of building a tunnel from the west side to Galveston Bay should be seriously considered. It was more or less dismissed in the report. I think it should be looked at again. The important point to me, though, is where does this come out? In my opinion, we really don't want this to come out in the Houston Ship Channel. To put 15,000 cubic feet per second of water into essentially downstream Buffalo Bayou, right where Greens Bayou comes in, right where Brays Bayou comes in, right where Sims Bayou comes in, right where Hunting Bayou comes in, not far from where White Oak comes in. That's just not where we ought to be adding flow. If we're going to build this, we ought to build it all the way to Galveston Bay and put the water directly into Galveston Bay. To me, that's what we're going to have to do if this tunnel is possible. I think going forward, the community needs to become much more involved in this process. We have got a huge problem, and it's not going to get solved the way we've been going forward. We have to have honesty. We have to have full disclosure. No code, no secrets. Lay it out. Yeah, it's almost as if the public can't handle the truth. We can't get the truth about back when Harvey was coming. I think the fear was the public was going to overreact to getting the information about the risk of flooding behind Addicks and Barker. I think there is a risk of that. Part of that would be minimized if we talked more about these things, if we had a process. I think we're going to have to be much more open. I think we're going to have to assume that our population can handle the truth. COVID may have helped a bit on that. That's not a fun reality to deal with, and we're all having to deal with it. There are other realities here in Houston that are not fun either, and flooding is one of them. We're going to have to get creative. I can understand the Corps being hesitant about talking about litigation and about this flood easement that the judge has ruled. On the other hand, it's just central. It's just critical to the solution. We can't ignore it. We cannot accept a document that ignores it and doesn't put it front and center and discuss it. I'd like to see us try to find a creative mediation process to try to bring all of these issues to the table at once. I think we're only limited by our creativity. As I've gotten older, I've found, frankly, there's better solutions outside of our institutional structure sometimes than within it. I think we can go there. This has to be bipartisan. This is not a blue or a red issue. This is a joint issue. I think you'll see in the panel discussion, the environmental community and the development community is more together than they've ever been in trying to find solutions here. Bottom line, we've got to be bold. This is not an easy problem. It has been building ever since Addicks and Barker were basically created. It's not going to get solved by just wishing it would get solved. We're going to have to be bold. We're going to have to be creative, and we're going to have to make some really neat stuff happening. And with that, hopefully that'll get us started on a panel discussion that will be interesting and lively. So, Mark, back to you.
Jim, I want to thank you so much for providing that level set. I know that a lot of things are happening, and every week we get something new in the paper. But I want to thank you for their frankness, the level set, and an easy to understand presentation on what's going on. Next, we're going to be doing our panel, and I want to introduce Mustafa Tamiz, but here in a second. We'll be doing our panel. Mustafa will be asking our great professionals here, when Larry gets his camera back on, some tough questions about what's going on, some efforts they're working on. And then around 12:40, 12:45, we're going to open it up to live questions from the audience. So I see some questions are already queued up. Just type in the chat, type in Q&A. We're happy to get to those questions, as many as we can. So before we start, I want to introduce our good friend at BCI, Mustafa Tamiz, with his little bio that I've done my best at shortening because it's a pretty long bio. Mustafa Tamiz is the president and founder of Outreach Strategist. He's a veteran of politics, national security studies, media, and community relations. Additionally, his experience with the Department of Homeland Security has also provided him the opportunity to help several law enforcement agencies forge relationships with communities and also serve them through cultural intelligence. So he's perfect for here today. Mustafa is a great friend of BCI, and we're thankful he can join us today. Mustafa, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Mark. And Jim, thank you so much for, as always, taking a very complicated issue and putting it in a way that all of us can understand it. So I really appreciate it. Jim has many titles, but he is the founder of Bayou City Initiative. And so thank you for your continued leadership in this issue. We're also joined by Auggie Campbell. Auggie is the executive director for Association of Water Board Directors. Mary Ann, who we all know and love, and Mary Ann's the president and CEO of Katy Perry Conservancy. And then Larry Dunbar, who's a senior partner of Dunbar and Harding. And we're going to get into a discussion with all of them, but I'd like to start here. Mary Ann, you and Auggie had done a piece for the Houston Chronicle that was widely circulated. It was titled Army Corps Report Favors the Wrong Flood Plans. Can you discuss, your views and the content of that article and some of the major points that you were making there?
Sure, thank you. Essentially, Auggie and I were trying to put together a synopsis of the whole process and what some of the recommendations were in the plan that would be more understandable than perhaps a 200-page document, and that would encourage the public to really get involved in this because it is crucial for our future. And so we looked at the shortcomings, we looked at the alternatives, we also looked at the fact that we were given 30 days to actually provide input back to the Corps. Now that was extended for a few more days beyond that, I think 10 days beyond that. But it certainly wasn't enough time to absorb a 200 pages document. We also identified the fact that the models and the rationale and the background that was used by the Corps to actually come up with their conclusions was not included. We did not have those appendices, as Jim mentioned earlier, and you really needed those to understand why the Corps was recommending something and rejecting other things. We also, and I'm going to talk in detail a little bit about the alternatives, but I want to say that we also tried to come up with some things that are more acceptable to the community. I think if the Corps did one thing, it brought the community together to say that this report is unacceptable. We don't agree with any of the recommendations. And that was important because it meant that we had a common focus for the community and that we could come together and to try to come up with better solutions. So we looked at things like the alternative one, which they had to consider, and that was do nothing. And obviously that's unacceptable. We looked at alternative two, which is a Cypress Creek reservoir, which would be placed over essentially most of the land that the Conservancy has protected over the last 22 years. And it also looked at, it's also a subtractive kind of thing. Why, if the lands on the Katy Prairie are already absorbing, slowing down, and storing water, would you put a reservoir over them? And then we looked at the channelization and the deepening and widening of Buffalo Bayou. And again, if in the 60s, it wasn't something that we should do, it's probably not something we should do in the 20s. And I think we found that the Corps disregarded some things that the public said in the scoping meetings. Look at natural infrastructure, look at nature-based projects, and try to use the benefits and the abilities that our own land has already. We have a gorgeous bayou system. Why not extend beyond the bayous some land so that when water does flow over it, there aren't people and property that are in harm's way? And then last but not least, we asked them to reconsider some of the projects that they discarded, like the tunnel. And then we also said, come up with scalable projects, come up with projects that work quickly, that are going to not wait 10, 20 years or have litigation involved them, so that we will put our community at risk again. And I think we've gotten a great response from it because it's begun to get people to say, hey, even if I don't live right here, what happens on this, in this report impacts me, because maybe I drive through, the State Highway 6 and it was underwater during Harvey and I couldn't get to work. Or maybe I live downstream where all the water is going. So I think that was our attempt to come up with a close way of getting the community involved and getting them to understand what it was all about.
Thanks, Mary Ann. Auggie, can you pick up from there and really talk about what are the alternatives that are provided by the Corps and focus in on some of the concerns that you and Mary Ann had?
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Mustafa. I really appreciate meeting with this group. And, really the Corps went through 8 different alternatives. And as Mary Ann just mentioned, the first one was doing nothing. And that's something that the Corps always has to consider. It's part of their framework for review. So it's not a surprise, but it's, to a certain extent, it's what's happened, because this is not the first report that the Corps has come out with since the 1940s. It's come out with a series of reports suggesting action. And the Corps is a bit frustrated that their reports have all resulted in no action. And I know that part of the reason they issued the interim report was to figure out if they could, by the time they get to a draft report, come up with something actionable. And it is really hard, because the interim report takes all these different ideas and then, looks at tunneling and then rejects it. It looks at excavating Addicks and Barker Reservoir and then really rejects that. And it rejected the tunnel for cost, and it rejected the excavation because of the water table and environmental issues, but then went on to look at a third reservoir and said, well, there aren't as many environmental issues with erecting a reservoir and a berm structure, which was concerning to Mary Ann and me and a lot of the people probably on this call. They also favored channelization of Buffalo Bayou over a tunnel. And again, that was really concerning for a number of reasons. And they, they looked at some of these items in combination, like what if you did a third reservoir and channel improvements, which is also not something that we thought was a good combination. So they went through and looked at a few more ideas. Obviously there's litigation and they can buy out behind reservoirs. And we, Mary Ann, we've asked Larry to provide some information. I think we've talked to just everybody on this panel at some point with our Houston Stronger group, which does, as we alluded to earlier, really include a bunch of folks from the development community, the environmental community, a number of different chambers, from the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the Black Chamber of Commerce, and Jewish federations. This is an issue that it doesn't matter what color, what ethnicity, what your income, like we all suffered from this. And so this is one of the few issues that has really, I think, united Houstonians in a way that I think is really constructive. And so Mary Ann's worked really hard to really create an issue where we can all come out better. And the Corps has got to be a part of this because they do hold a very big chunk of money, both in terms of the litigation and in terms of this 216 study and what Congress can potentially do. So I think, we can, hopefully we'll get through a few more of the different alternatives, but there are a lot of opportunities that are unique to this time as opposed to all the previous studies we've seen.
Well, Larry, I want to pull you into this conversation. Jim, Auggie, Mary Ann, they serve as conveners. And so a lot of conversation about this issue, about this Corps report is really stemming from the conversations that they're leading, as Auggie mentioned, in different parts of Houston with different communities and constituencies. Is this effort, on the right path? Can this make a difference in educating the public on these issues?
Yeah, the litigations tend to kind of be done somewhat outside of the public purview. They're kind of in the courtroom. And so a lot of what goes on during litigation, the information exchanged and learned, legal rulings, those kind of things, most of the time the public isn't aware of it. And that's proceeding. It's been going on for now almost over 3 years, and we're continuing to have that litigation. As Jim mentioned, the judge found a liability for the Corps of Engineers on the upstream side for causing the flooding, and we're now in the damages phase of that litigation to determine how much the Corps needs to pay for causing those damages. But at the same time, then the Corps is doing this 216 study, and it's kind of running parallel with the litigation. And that process is much more open, obviously, being put out there for public review and comment, which gives the community an opportunity to get a little better understanding of some of the issues, some of the information, the things the Corps looked at in trying to address the problem, and get some public feedback. As Jim mentioned, that report by the Corps does not talk about the litigation. It's probably a little unfortunate because it doesn't allow the public to understand how that litigation fits into the overall picture of what's attempting to be done here. The litigation won't necessarily, quote, solve the problem. It addresses, how the plaintiffs who flooded during Harvey because of the reservoir pools backing water up behind the dams, how they can get compensated for their damages. That doesn't eliminate the fact that we have another Harvey rain, and if nothing changes physically out there, we're going to have flooding again, just like we've seen both upstream and downstream. And even if and even worse, we had 30-inch rain fall over the Annex and Barker watersheds that caused the flooding we saw of 10,000 homes in those reservoirs. Harvey, though, on the east side of town, produced over 40 inches of rain. And the Corps of Engineers looked at what would have happened if that amount of rain from Harvey had actually fallen in the Annex and Barker watershed. The flooding would have been significantly worse. We could have had as much as 20,000 homes flood. And so that's to me, that's the problem. I mean, there is a problem in terms of the flood risks that those dams create, both upstream and downstream, that I think this 216 study was trying to address and figure out how to deal with it, independent of what the litigation itself might do, which is really not going to fix the problem. It's going to address very specific legal issues and legal damages. So I think the 216 study is a great way to go. As Jim said and others, the report, was very limited as to the kind of information I think we all really need and want to be able to really evaluate exactly what the problem is and the best way to go about trying to solve it. And as Augie said, financing, finding the money to do it is also part of the problem. But one thing the litigation did do is at least established, at least for the upstream side, that the Corps caused that problem. And so the Corps, the federal government, needs to be seriously looking at how to arguably try to fix that problem.
Jim, when you were talking about the Corps, you said you've worked with the Corps. You've also sued the Corps probably almost like 20 times, I think, right? So you've been in litigation involved with the Corps. So you've had lots, like I know that you have deep ties in working relationships and know how hard some of the people in the Corps work, but you also understand the legal side of this. And so help us understand that from a litigation side, is there a danger of precedent setting that the Corps is concerned about?
Well, sure. I think that, there's sort of danger signals in a lot of different areas, in a lot of ways. I think, first of all, lawyers have obligations to clients. But it's very difficult when litigation is ongoing to get, frankly, an honest discussion of positions, an honest discussion of strengths and weaknesses of cases, because everybody's in litigation mode. You're trying to put your best arguments forward, and you've got essentially fiduciary obligations to your clients. So on the one hand, I think to answer your question, to do anything externally to kind of either jump into or involve the public, if you will, in a discussion about a lawsuit it's a tricky process. Nobody that's involved in litigation wants outside interference as a general proposition. I don't think I've ever seen a situation where the public had as much legitimate interest in the outcome of a litigation as is this case, because there's so many. It basically kind of almost sets the stage. And I wish the Corps would have just said, we're just going to punt until a decision, until we get a final point on what's going to happen with the litigation, and then all sorts of options open up from that. I think if we could create what I would call a free space, a safe space where there could be honest conversation about how to combine really what the Corps is trying to do with 216, what the lawsuit is trying to do, and to try to see if there's a way to mediate this creatively. That's what I would like to see. I've never seen it done before. And I would think that our congressional delegation may be in the best shape to pull something like that off, because they're the ones that actually run the Corps of Engineers. Ultimately, the Corps is responsible to Congress. Congress, in a way, has put them in the bad position that they're in with a lot of these rules and regulations that they've got. Congress needs to take control of this situation in one way or another. And I think we should look to our congressional delegation for leader. I think they have the ability to do things others of us cannot. The other alternative would be to create some sort of a committee of the public to almost convene a people's proceeding to try to come up with solutions and bring them to the congressional delegation and say, look, this is what we think we need, and have some sort of blue ribbon authority associated with that. Anything to get us out of the box, because the institutional structure we're in right now basically will keep us going the direction we're going. And I think there are better ways to go.
Great. As Jim talked and we talked about the Bayou City initiative, there's so many different groups with so many different perspectives. But the Cary Prairie has a significant role in this. What part of the plan, what concerns you, and what is kind of the recommendation from you as we move forward?
Well, I think a lot of it concerned us because in the scoping meetings, which we participated in fairly extensively, and we were even on a resource team for the Corps of Engineers, we kept emphasizing the fact that we need to, while we need engineered solutions, we also need to look at what is already being done with natural infrastructure or nature-based solutions. So that's why we thought, well, when you look at the Cypress Creek Reservoir, a couple things. One, do we want another reservoir that could fail just the way that essentially Addicks and Barker failed? We don't want something that has to have an operational system. We'd really rather say, let's use the value of the land to absorb water, to slow it down, and to store it. And there are tons of parts of the county, not just the Katy Prairie, but forested wetlands, creek sides that can hold water if we just let them. Sort of like what the Dutch say with make room for the river. Let's make room for our bayous. Let's make room for our depressional wetlands. We also, we do care about making sure that there's a solution, because we don't want anyone to flood. We don't want a home to be destroyed. We know that we don't want one person to die because they drowned or they were flooded out and they had no ability to make money or to live. So one of the things that the Conservancy did with Larry Dunbar's help and Phil Bedient's help, the Speed Center, is actually try to come up with our own plan. And we looked at what was good out of what the Corps was talking about and what did we want to reject. And so we came up with what we call the Prairie Solution to Reduce Flooding. And is it perfect? No. But the good news is, and I'll give you a brief overview of it. The good news is that we're now working with Houston Stronger, so that there are conservation groups, there are environmental groups, there are development groups, there are engineers. There are people that are saying we need to go beyond engineering, that are starting to say, hey, let's use some of what maybe the Katy Prairie Conservancy came up with, and let's also maybe look at some other elements that could work. And so we had recommended in our plan a four-prong approach. One is go ahead and excavate Barker and Addicks. It can be done quickly. It's owned by the government. You don't have to buy any land. And we think that if you do the in-depth analysis, you actually could, we thought double the capacity. Maybe it's less than double the capacity, but something could be done to store more water. We also thought looking at a tunnel. If you're going underground and you don't have to destroy people's homes by buying it up and, moving them out of it, so that you can do some above ground kinds of conveyance. Wouldn't a tunnel work? And yes, it's expensive, but what's the value of a human's life? What's the value of all the property? What's the value of work lost, kind of thing? And so we look at that and say it's been done in other parts of not the world, other parts of Texas. Dallas and San Antonio and Austin either have or are going to have tunnels. We then also looked at Upper Addicks watershed, sort of north of the reservoirs. That provides a 1-to-1 reduction in floodwaters down to Addicks Reservoir. So every bucket of water we can store in the Upper Addicks watershed reduces a bucket of water in the reservoirs. And we also know that those lands aren't developed yet. Sure, there are a lot of people that are looking at it. The pandemic hasn't stopped people from wanting to live farther west and build, and it's a hot spot. But if we do it now and we do it quickly, we've actually saved money. Yes, it's expensive, but it's a lot more expensive if you have to buy somebody out or you have to pay them to rebuild their house because they're built in an area that is going to flood. We also looked at South Mady and Bear Creek. I mean, how wonderful it would be to have those as recreational opportunities, but also to have the sides of those creeks be able to be open and available when the water rises and it needs to go onto the sides of our bayous and our creeks. And then last but not least, and we're doing some of this privately, so it's this nice public-private partnership. How much more land can we save on the Katy Prairie? How much more can we restore? And how much can we work with private individuals to maybe hold and detain some water on their property if they were to be able to receive some money for it? In the Harris County Flood Control District and Precinct 4, I'll give great credit for, they actually did a study with the people who've done a lot of work in the Netherlands, the Dutch, to say, can we hold water in these properties and give them money to hold it back? So our plan is, again, really high level concept. We didn't identify what were all of the costs, but I think Larry and Phil did some excellent modeling work to show that some of that could work and that it would be of value. And so I think one of the things that we want to figure out a way to do is to say that if we don't use our natural ability to hold water and our natural capacities, we're losing out on something, because nature, I love this quote and I use it way too much, but I love it. It's that never does wisdom say one thing and neither does nature say one thing and wisdom another. So we need to use nature, but also it's the case that, natural infrastructure withstands extreme events better. And it also is going to be dealing with climate change. So let's use it and let's benefit from it. And it was very disappointing that the Corps just discarded it totally because they said it doesn't do enough. Well, let's use incremental things. Let's scale it and let's do it for the whole county. And let's also use it for vulnerable communities which haven't gotten much investment in flood risk reduction. And it provides not just flood risk reduction, but community benefits like improved air and water quality. It provides recreational opportunities. Maybe it's nature tourism, and it makes life just better in general.
Just broadening our approach to problem solving, right? Rather than just an engineering solution. I want to talk about something that Marion, that you'd mentioned, and I want to make sure that we capture it a little bit. You had talked about the third reservoir, right? Mm-hmm. Is that going to affect the Katy Prairie, and yeah. Who else is that going to affect?
Right. Well, we don't exactly know how much it's going to affect the Katy Prairie Conservancy, because the maps that the Corps provided only show 17,000 acre reservoir, but it's actually a 22,000 acre reservoir, and we can't get that information from them, not even when asked by Texas Parks and Wildlife or Fish and Wildlife Service. But with just the 17,000 one, it basically takes 60% of the land that we've protected. And that land isn't just owned by the Katy Prairie Conservancy. It's owned by a number of private individuals who donated the conservation or development rights, the development rights of those land so that they could protect the conservation values. So they're going to have to buy out a lot of land. And initially, when they looked at a third reservoir, it was like it was going to be free because the Katy Prairie Conservancy had already accumulated all that land. Well, it's not free. It's expensive. But worse than that, what it does is that it destroys the flora and the fauna that's there. It destroys the ability to actually have people go there. Not because when it's dry, it could be a great recreational resource. I will be very honest. It could have ball fields. It could have all that other stuff. But I was told by the former colonel, not Colonel Vail, but Colonel Zetterstrom, that they could hold water in the Cypress Creek Reservoir for 6 months if necessary. So if it's underwater, who gets to use it? How do the plants survive? How do the cattle survive? They don't. So our sense is, why subtract the value we already provide? Why not add to it? If you're going to have a reservoir, have the mini ones we talk about, which are 1,500 acres or fewer. And you can solve some of the similar problems, because on the Katy Prairie, that only protects it only offers 40% reduction in floodwaters. It's not a 1-to-1. I think Auggie says it's 1-to-3. I'm never really good at that those ratios, but he said that it's 1-3 instead of 1-1. So why not go to upper attics and say, let's provide some more benefit there. And let's also, make sure that that is, every bucket stored is a bucket reduced in attics, which is not what we do. Our bucket is only 2/5 full. And that's not as good. So, and also I don't think that the Corps recognized that private philanthropy and individuals have made an extraordinary gift to help this whole community have access to the Katy Prairie Conservancy. And while right now we don't have public access on every preserve we have, the eventual hope is that we will have more and more people who will be able to use it, kind of like a memorial park, but without, no ball fields. More, Memorial Park has tennis courts and things like that, but trails and bicycle routes and those kinds of things, and bird watching. And so it's a gift.
And mountains, don't forget
and mountains. Yes, we need a few mountains. But it's also improves air and water quality. So, and sequesters carbon. Jim knows this. We've been trying to work with him on a number of projects. And that's a gift to all of Houston and to all of Texas. So why would we want to destroy it?
So Auggie,
Try not to be long-winded.
No, that's perfect. I mean, I think you bring up a very important point, that the solution is not just an engineering solution. Like, there has to be other things that have to come to bear. And Auggie, in order to have a more broader solution, you have to bring those different voices and get them to sit on the same table. And so I know that you brought together environmental groups, engineers, developers to the same table. So how did you manage that? And do you credit the Corps for this unlikely partnership?
I will credit Hurricane Harvey first. And really, to a certain extent, tax day and previous floods. Mary Ann has been at a table with the flood control district and other developer interests for before I left the city of Houston in the legal department, where I was arguing with Jim Blackburn about how to get water all the way to the bay, and Jim won and did a great job. But what I will say is that
just to pause here for one quick second. It's like, I've learned over the years, you don't argue with Jim Blackburn, you always lose. So
yeah,
so that comes across outside of the litigation as well.
So, and that's where, I always want to figure out how to get on the same side of the table as Jim Blackburn. So that's part of the strategy, right?
Right.
But part of it's just listening, because, Jim's, y'all have heard Jim. I mean, you don't want to argue with Jim. He's reasonable. He makes good points. He's highly intelligent. Same with Larry. So part of this is just, going through that exercise of really listening to all the concerns. And really bringing the Corps in to do the same thing. I mean, and I think really, to be fair with the Corps, the reason that they were putting out the interim report is because their calculations, what they were running through their models, was so bad, they didn't like it. And they didn't want to get to a draft report with what their models were spitting out. And so I think, there is a little bit of a, back in 1920 or 1935, Houston asked for help. And I think in 2020, to a certain extent, the Corps is asking for our help. And I think we should really give it to them. I think we do have to basically go in and say, we understand your BCR issues. We understand sort of the reason that the models are spitting out the same results. And here are the ways that we think you can overcome it. And I think, Larry and Mary Ann and Jim have all done a good job, getting different data sets and different ideas together that we can act upon. And I think there are a lot of developers that have done, and engineers who've done good at, put together some good ideas on how to act. And that's what's really been exciting about Houston Stronger, is seeing how, you have those ideas come up and you work through them and you figure out at the end of the discussion which ideas are still standing and acceptable, and then refining those ideas so they really do solve the issue. And I think we've put together a plan. It's got a $6 billion price tag on it, and that involves, excavating attics and Barker Reservoir, the flood tunnels, upper attics work, and then, some other ideas as well. And, the real challenge is going to be, can you get this through the court process? Can you get the litigation in a position where it can help fund it? So can you get all these different complications to kind of align? Because there's a solution on the table. The biggest issue with providing that solution is just getting the buy-in, that we're all going to, there is, if you're a plaintiff, you could get a bigger check if you go for all damages, but you won't have your nice home. You'd have to go find someplace else to live. If you're, an environmental group, there are things that you can spend your energy elsewhere. If you're a developer, like maybe you could get a little bit more land if you didn't buy into the solution. So I think everybody has to realize that you're going to have to give up a little bit of what you could potentially get to get something that you can really hold on to and really does a better job of solving everybody's problem.
One of the solutions that's floating out there is tunnels. And I grew up in Queens. Subway tunnels underneath are just part of life. The Holland and Lincoln Tunnel connecting New York and New Jersey is part of life. But in Houston, that seems to be like a new way of thinking, right? So talk a little bit about that, like what's the design look like, and then estimated cost. And then I also want you to take a minute to talk about the municipal utility districts if we were to do some buyouts.
Yeah, well, and I'll actually start with the second question first. If you do buy out these municipal utility, if you buy out the houses, there's still a lot of bond obligations that are beneath that for the streets and the roads, and that creates businesses and schools. And so basically, not just the municipal utility districts that rely on it, but school districts. And I do think that Jim's right, that if you buy out those homes, it not only you leave these incomplete communities that can't fund their obligations. You have schools that I think will suffer greatly, and so you take communities that are really successful right now and self-reliant in as much as any community can be self-reliant, right? And you make them where they will have some huge environmental justice and economic justice challenges. And I think those are potentially avoided through a tunnel. And so to talk about the cost of the tunnel and the challenges of the tunnel, one, we're not New York. New York has just this nice kind of granite soil. So obviously we have to look at, the challenges of our geography, what's below the ground. But Houston has a lot of pipes running underneath it right now. So we know how to do pipelines for oil and gas, for water. This is a bit bigger animal, but it is one that, our engineering partners, many different engineering firms have looked at it. The geotechnical firms that I've talked to have all said this is, not an easy task, but it's certainly doable. I mean, our soil is a lot easier than the soil in like San Francisco, or it's very similar to the soil in DC. And they have actually put in tunnels in those areas with, a large amount of success. And so the cost, and it depends on who you ask. If you ask the flood control district, they're talking about, about $3 billion to $6 billion, with about 4.25 probably being, their best guess at what it would cost for about a 20-mile tunnel, and diameter of the tunnel factors into this too. And so I think we're talking, Larry, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's the 30-foot diameter tunnel. And so if you look at that from the Corps' perspective, the Corps came out with a cost of between $6 and $12 million. So basically,
Billion.
Yeah, did I say million? It is. It's just this mind-blowing number of, it's a big number. In any respect, it is a big number. But basically, the Corps' number is twice that of the flood control districts. So the neat thing about a tunnel is that it, you don't have the same environmental impact. It also allows you to if you have a tunnel and it goes from Addicks and Barker, I think the outfall for that tunnel is something that we need to talk about very seriously. Jim's absolutely right. So you're going to select an outfall point. It'll add, it's about $100 million a mile. So there is, a lot of additional cost to go just a little distance. So it's expensive. But if you look at the alternative cost of conveyance along Buffalo Bayou and what we think it would really cost, it's actually pretty similar. And it gets you out of having to do other things upstream and with the reservoirs, and reduces that risk inside the reservoirs that Jim is so rightly worried about. If you have a flood tunnel, it means that there's not this huge wall of water that's stored behind these berms. It can go down in the tunnel. The tunnel creates additional storage and can create additional water supply. We've talked a lot. Well, we haven't talked a lot on this call, but we can get to that point in a little bit. But to provide sort of the final benefit of a flood tunnel is that with the technology of directional drilling, you can reach out to neighborhoods that have localized flooding issues that would not be helped at all by channel conveyance in Buffalo Bayou, that would be helped from a flood tunnel if we size it right. So we need to think a lot about the size and the outfall and water quality when it comes to the flood tunnel. These are all challenges that are real, and I don't want to minimize. I've talked to a lot of different experts in these areas, and they think there are potential solutions on how to get the most out of a tunnel.
All right, so we're going to start our audience questions. I think just now. So if you're in the audience, just go to your either Q&A or the chat section and start putting in your questions, and I'll look through it. But Jim, is channelizing the Buffalo Bayou a solution?
Well, I think it could increase capacity. I don't think of it as being a solution, because I think the problem is Addicks and Barker. And I think if you fix Addicks and Barker, and the way you fix Addicks and Barker, you don't need to channelize Buffalo. So I don't see it being a solution to Addicks and Barker. If we're stuck with the way Addicks and Barker are operating now, we've got a 15,000 CFS release problem. I think that's going to be a key. But I've talked to Phil Bedient over at Speed Center about Buffalo, and said Buffalo basically performs well, except for 15,000 CFS of release. So it's really about fixing Addicks and Barker's issues, and I think that it's important to kind of keep that in mind. I'd hate to see us do something like destroy Buffalo Bayou just because we can't figure out what to do with Addicks and Barker. But that seems to be one of the ways that we're thinking, and I just disagree with that way of thinking. Larry may be able to help more on that than I in some of the capacity issues there, but I haven't really looked in great detail at the plan from that standpoint.
Well, Buffalo Bayou, as we found from Harvey, can have significant flood damages independent of the releases from the reservoirs. Buffalo Bayou has a much smaller floodplain than almost any bayou in the community, and that's largely because of Addicks Barker reservoirs. Buffalo Bayou, the natural channel, was having to handle water from the Addicks watershed, the Barker watershed, and the rest of Buffalo Bayou watershed. When those dams were built, that cut off 2/3 of the watershed. Was just, that water was held back. And so you had this big channel that naturally got formed to handle a lot of water, and now it only has to handle more localized water. It still has some flooding issues, but not to the extent as a lot of the other bayous that we deal with.
Larry, while I got you, there's a question from our Houston City Councilwoman Sally Alcorn. Do we know the status of downstream lawsuits? You want to talk a little bit about that?
The status that I know is, and it's a little complicated. The upstream
Sally doesn't ask easy questions. Sally always asks complicated questions. It's the way it is.
The upstream lawsuit had a judge, and he made his ruling in favor of the plaintiffs. The downstream lawsuit is kind of a separate set of lawsuits, has a separate judge, and he ruled that the downstream folks did not have a viable claim against the Corps of Engineers. And he ruled that on behalf of 13 test properties. But there were thousands of people who flooded, thousands of people who made a claim downstream, just kind of like what was happening upstream. And so those other people and the lawyers representing them said, wait a second, Judge, we don't agree that your ruling for those 13 people is the right ruling for the rest of us. And so the judge said, okay, send me a brief and let me look at it. He got some briefs, he looked at them, and he said, okay, I'm still going to rule for those 13 test properties. They don't have a viable claim. And I'm still considering the other ones. So downstream's kind of in a weird place. I'm sure the lawyers representing those 13 folks are going to appeal that ruling once it becomes final. But downstream has always had, in my opinion, has always had a more difficult challenge in trying to win a successful lawsuit against the Corps of Engineers for causing their flooding than the upstream. It clearly caused flooding downstream. That actually wasn't the issue. It's more of a nuance with constitutional law as to whether or not the Corps of Engineers can be found to be legally liable for causing that flooding. And that judge said, no, Corps is not liable. But it's not the end of the story yet.
Okay. Augie, you were talking about the tunnels, and we got a question saying, could the tunnel system carry water to the Brazos River?
It's possible, but you'd be trading flooding, one part of Houston for flooding another part of Houston. And we think that that's not a viable alternative. Your real benefit is taking it to the bay where you have, such a big bathtub that your flooding risk goes to just about zero. And if you put it in the Brazos, there are plenty of communities on the Brazos. There are plenty of environmental issues on the Brazos that you create by just diverting the water to the Brazos as opposed to taking it to the bay.
And let me follow up on that, Mustafa. We've looked at that, and the Brazos River during Harvey reached 100-year flood level during Harvey. So why would you then want to take water from Buffalo watershed and put more of it into the Brazos River and cause more flooding? And that's the real problem with diverting waters from one watershed to another, is you really want, if you're going to divert it or send it somewhere, you want to send it to a place where it can handle it safely. And that's a great way to put it. And whenever you have a rain event like Harvey, it's generally so big that it's impacting the entire region. So you can't just go to the next watershed over. You really have to find a way to get it where it needs to go.
So Larry, can I say it's almost like the release, right? Letting the water go, it's going to impact somebody. It's going to go somewhere, right?
Right. And
impact somebody who wasn't impacted before.
And that's the purpose of the tunnel, is to say, hey, let's put the releases somewhere where it can't impact anybody, like 150 feet underground. Okay, it's a good idea, and that is kind of the idea. But then, as Augie said, you got to look at where it's got to come out somewhere. You got to look at where it's going to come out and make sure it's not going to cause any impact.
Well, and it's always going to cause some impact. It's just like, how negative is that impact? And it's just everything's sort of a trade-off. And I'm not competing with Larry on engineering prowess, but I've been, beaten over the head by engineers for long enough to know that every time we talk about like moving water somewhere, like there's going to be an impact. It's just whether that impact is how adverse that impact is.
Let me go.
And I think that if we, sorry.
No, you go ahead, man.
I was just going to say, I think one thing that we are going to find is if we do a tunnel and it's successful, it could actually be used in other parts of the county as well and the region, because it's not a one size fit all, but you could do another tunnel, say in the Cypress Creek watershed, where there's not a lot of room for waters to flow. And a lot of those people flood. So what about another one there? What about, we talked about inlets to help street flooding. And so I think if we can get this right, we might find that this could be helpful throughout our flooded areas, even in Montgomery County or Waller County. So might as well try it.
Let me go like up the tunnel into the upstream. I have an upstream question. You know, if there are upstream buyout, does the federal government pay or does the county pay? Jim, why don't you take that?
I mean, as it's structured, being the the lawsuit where the finding of a taking was made is a lawsuit against the federal government. So that is the federal government paying. If a buyout were proposed as part of the Corps of Engineers 216 project, that would be federal money, I guess, in the main part. There would maybe some local match to go with it. So I would say we're really talking about federal money, at least in the context of this conversation. The flood control district has money in the bond issue that could be used for buyouts. And it may be that we want to make selective buyouts in certain places. There may be a home or two here or there that are just really, say, down and brought, too close to the edge of a creek, that are right on the edge of the Buffalo Bayou with the erosion, and it's going to be lost in the next few years. You can have selective buyouts with local money, but we're talking federal money here for the most part.
Okay, every time I think I'm out of the tunnel, they pull me back in. There's another audience question on the tunnel. It says Hurricane Harvey cost $125 billion. Why is $6 billion investment in tunnels not the very smart investment if it even slightly mitigate the next Harvey?
I could not agree more. I mean, and I think it blows my mind that the National Flood Insurance Program and FEMA can't just say, "Well, we'll give you the money." Like this would do much to help our National Flood Insurance Program. It's sort of ridiculous. But we're talking about who's paying. Back almost to the last question. And if the Corps is paying for it, the Corps has to go through a very rigid framework. And it has to go over this hurdle that's kind of artificially created by the infrastructure that's already here. So basically, when the Corps looks at their models, it says that Addicks and Barker provide over $3 billion of benefit to our region every year. And so basically, any project that we're trying to score really has to stand on its own and basically stand above what already exists that the Corps has already invested. Because of this national economic development model, there are other communities that really haven't gotten the same level of investment support that Houston has. And so that's one of the reasons it's such a challenge for us to get this money from the Corps, because we got, as certain, people from the Corps like to say, we got these folks in Iowa who, haven't gotten a dollar, and, they wonder why their dollars are going to Houston. And I think there are really good reasons. It's just that the Corps is not really allowed to look at it whenever it asks for money.
Right. And this is what I was talking about, the need to reform the benefit cost kind of methods and the way we think about them, because it really works against us.
I think the other part of that formula is the Corps of Engineers in their analyses treat Harvey as an event that would only occur once every 1,000 years. And therefore, what is the value of spending, $5-10 billion to save $125 billion of damages that theoretically, according to their statistics, would only happen once every 1,000 years. Now, I think most people in Houston believe that, it is very likely we're going to get another Harvey type rain, probably easily within our lifetime. If not, maybe even the next 10 years.
I mean, we had Imelda that came in right after Harvey that was right about the same level. But this is climate change. This is integrating climate change thinking into these methods, and we just don't do it well yet. And that's what we're going to have to deal with.
Right. And so if the Corps were to acknowledge that a Harvey type event could occur once every 10 years, once every 50 years, it would change the economics significantly. But they don't.
So, like what I hear from all of you, and sometimes I'm not sure if we all can connect these dots in our heads, that these are complicated issues and they can't be solved by how we used to look at them almost a century ago. and we can't fix them by not acknowledging climate change on the one hand, but also not using some natural solutions that have been working from the beginning of the planet, right? So I think that's the missing kind of piece in this, that we don't have a holistic view, and our bureaucracies aren't designed to come up with modern day solutions that we need. One question that came from the audience that I think it's interesting about this is that, can the Harris County Flood Control take the lead in Section 216 study? They are the local partners. Jim, do you want to take that for a second? Because I think that's it's a local entity. So do they have jurisdiction to do this?
Well, I mean, they don't have jurisdiction to take over the 216 study per se. I do think there is a role. I think they have to be careful, though. I mean, I think in a way we have to protect flood control district. I think it would be better for others. Flood control district has to work with the Corps day in and day out on a lot of different issues. And to take a really strong, say, almost adversarial position saying, we need to do something totally different on this project might put them in a position of jeopardizing other relationships. I think we're going to have some people that don't have to worry so much about maintenance of those relationships. So I would say that, in theory, the flood control district could take off on its own, but I don't think that that's what I would advise. I would find another course. Larry, Auggie, Mary Ann, y'all might disagree with me on that, but that's kind of where I see it.
I think the flood control district has another challenge, and that's it's in the business of executing projects that are voted on by commissioners court, and not in the business of trying to come up with, these grand plans on their own. So I think there is a role for the community, and I think some of our commissioners have been very creative in the way that they've approached the problem. That's appreciated.
And I wanted to just kind of clear that point up, because sometimes it feels like when you can't get to the core, when you can't get the federal, who can I put pressure on locally, right? And I think sometimes our advocacy has to be holistic, just like the solutions have to be more holistic. If that makes any sense, right? Because so we're just angry at somebody, we just want to find the person that we can get to, right?
Right. But Congress is the conduit, and I think Congress is the key. It's going to require creative thinking. It's going to require working together, but I think Congress is the key.
I think that's.
Can
I think that's.
Can I add to that? Because
Yeah, please.
I know that some of our Congress people have actually been looking at the sort of outdated criteria of the benefit cost ratios and the national economic development model, and saying this doesn't work in 2020, and certainly not after the pandemic and all the things we're going through. So I think that if we could actually work with them to try to say, look, here are some far-reaching solutions. Here are some things that are adaptive, that are, going to make a difference, that I think there's at least some interest, and there'll be some support for that. Now, again, Auggie, alluded to this earlier, is that it has to be done countrywide, through the United States, because what works for us has to kind of work for Iowa, and it has to work for California. But I think that even those of us in the conservation community have recognized that the federal government is starting to look at how can you quantify sort of prevention, not recovery. But if you did sort of $1 worth of prevention, might save $6 worth of recovery dollars. Well, doesn't that make sense? I mean, but also looking at our national flood insurance. Should we really allow people to be in dangerous zones without paying a gazillion dollars? Probably not. And we're starting to change those things. But that's something that takes a big lift. And it's going to be our people in, the Senate and the House that are going to have to help us using scientific knowledge, using engineering knowledge, environmental conservation, using everybody. And I can't emphasize this enough, also using real people who maybe don't have the sort of expertise, but have the experience of having to go through a flood, or having to know what life is like when you live next to a sewer plant that has gotten disrupted because of a storm, and bring all that together. And yes, it's complex, and yes, it's complicated, but Houston always says it does it bigger and better. Why can't we come up with those kinds of things working together?
And to be fair, I do think that Lizzie Fletcher and Dan Crenshaw have done some really good community events that help, and they're not alone. Like there have been a lot of people in our congressional delegation who've kind of put on these community events and asked questions and good ones. And I think, we need to continue to ask them to ask those questions and then, kind of press for answers. And there are a lot of resources in the community, Mary Ann's point.
Let me jump in and say, I think that federal lawsuit, both the upstream and downstream, I think they provide a unique opportunity. And I mean, Mary Ann, one of the things I am a little concerned about is we've got to come up with something that either works for the rest of the country, or we've got to find a way around that concern. These lawsuits are what is unique about this whole situation. And I just, again, in looking at this situation, if I'm looking at opportunity, those lawsuits are in a way, I mean, that's the real wild card. And I know there's a way to be fair to the people and also integrate this thinking about creative solutions. And I mean, these people were kind of certainly within their rights. They went out and took care of themselves. Government didn't take care of them. They're doing it on their own, but it is a unique situation that gives us a different place.
Well, thank you all. I think we're coming to the end of our time with all of you. I just want to ask just kind of this final question, but we'll just go around to each of you real quickly. There's a lot of things that have to be done, right? There's there's a newer way of thinking that we have to build and develop. When we look at the where we are politically today, to get something through Congress seems very hard. When we think about not having earmarks anymore, to getting specific funding for a particular regional project seems very hard. So people can walk away from this problem and be overwhelmed and feel like it's not really ever going to happen. Just take a minute and tell me why each of you are optimistic about the future and our ability, if we have any, to actually fix these problems. So let's start with you, Mary Ann.
Okay, well, actually, my husband and I were talking about this morning, and we were coming up with a kind of an approach, not for this session, but just for talks in general. And one of the points he thought about was and I'm gonna say it the initial way and then paraphrase it, but to think globally and act locally. The truth is that I think we can come up with brilliant ideas. And I think, though, in order to make it happen, we have to have our boots on the ground, and we have to all be committed to it. And it's not just a problem of the West Side at all. And I want to emphasize that more and more. It is a problem for our whole community if we can't solve the flooding problem, because it means that businesses aren't going to want to locate here. I was talking after the tax day flood with two big companies, and they were starting to say, my people want to move. They don't want to stay here, or I can't recruit people. Well, that's a horrible thing. And also another thing is that all of us, I hope, whether we have children or not, we have friends, we have family, we want to leave a legacy. And is the legacy we want to leave that you live in a place that could flood you out, or your friends could, lose their properties? So I think that together we might not be able to do everything we want, but we might be able to do things that start quickly and incrementally and make a difference and build on that. And I just think that there are a lot of really smart people in this community, and that together we can do it. But we all have to work at it, and we all have to think about something that I think maybe has been forgotten, and that is, what can we do for the common good, not just for our individual selves.
Larry,
That's why I'm optimistic.
Well, great. Well, Larry, take your lawyer hat and be optimistic, but be brief. So you have to take your lawyer hat to be brief and to be optimistic.
Got it. I'm always optimistic. I'm optimistic, I think, because Harvey was a wake-up call for all of us. It kind of showed how the entire county has flooding issues. Not, you have Allison that hit one side of the community. You had other storms that hit another area. Harvey hit everybody at the same time and said, look, we have a big problem here, and what are we going to do to fix it? And we are starting to do things to fix it. You had the $2.5 billion bond approval from Harris County, the rebuild, to try to fix some of the problems. You had Rebuild Houston monies be put and approved to try to get money to kind of improve some of the local drainage problems. So I'm optimistic that we can't, well, I know we can address the problem. The question is, do we have the political will? And I think Harvey gave a lot of people the opportunity to say, we now realize we have a problem, and the public now knows we have a problem and are willing to spend the money to fix it. Because we want to be the Bayou City. We don't want to be known as the flood city. And I'm afraid we are known as the flood city.
Great. Auggie, quickly, what are we optimistic about?
I'm optimistic because it's like all these problems are here at once. And I think anytime you have, this crisis is not going to waste. I think that whenever you see the sort of people getting together and talking that we have, that should be a real source of optimism. The way that the community responded and continues to respond. The only thing that's bothersome is that we're 3 years out from Harvey and we don't have everything together. The commitment, though, is still there. And that's what makes me really optimistic.
Great. Jim, take us home.
I would say the optimistic thing is that Mary Ann and Auggie and I and Larry are all sitting around talking with each other positively about solutions. And
Yeah.
I think that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a unique moment of where the community can come together. And I think coming out of that, there will be strength. So that gives me optimism.
That's great. So if you are watching, please go to the Bayou City Initiative website, sign in so that you can get more information about these events and convenings that Jim Blackburn and the rest of the team puts together. So that's one important way for us to stay in touch with each other. Mark, is there anything else that you want to add before we end?
Just a quick thank you to our panelists, to you, Mustafa, Jim, Marianne, Larry, Auggie, always learning something new during these sessions. Thank you everyone for attending. What's going to happen next is we're going to be recording this meeting. We're going to be sending it off to everyone. You'll get an email for helpful links on what you can do to further this message, and also a link on all the plans that have been talked about today from Houston Stronger, from Cary Prairie Conservancy, from Larry, from Auggie. It'll be a one-stop shop for all the information. Other than that, thank y'all so much for being here, for attending. Yes.
Can I say, if you send the chat to, I'll offer it. I don't know if everybody else will, but there are lots of great questions in the chat, and be happy to try to respond at least to the ones that impact or affect us, if we can do that.
Of course.
And
we'll save these questions and we'll send them off. And again, we'll do our best to answer these. I think a lot of these questions are like one-page white paper type questions, but we'll do our best to provide answers. Again, thank y'all so much. Feel free to go to our Facebook page, give us a like, follow us on Twitter. We're here because of y'all, and we only exist because of y'all. So thank y'all so much. And that is the end of our meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Bye. Stay safe.
Thank you.